Okay, well, we're live. And uh, the message tonight is three women and a dead king. I probably, although it would have been kind of long to say it, but it's more like three women, a dead king, and a dead warrior. But if you would, if you're interested in following along in the Word of God, um, Judges chapter 4 and 5. We'll be in Judges chapter 4 and Judges chapter 5 tonight. Judges chapter 4. Three women and a dead king and a warrior. From the very earliest of time, God has used women. Eve, the mother of the living. God created women to be helpmates and wives and servants of the Most High God. God elevated women in all sorts of circumstances. He has through all of the history that we're given in the scriptures, and which starts at the very beginning, of course. God has blessed women who have loved him and served him, again, in all sorts of circumstances. And oh my, the sermons over the last 2,000 years, millions probably, the sermons that have been preached about Mary, the mother of Jesus, songs have been written, poems have been written, all about Mary, Virgin Mary. Many times when there's been no man of God to step up to the plate, our Lord has used women. In fact, that's a little part of the story that we have tonight, kind of. There are just so many women that could be talked about. Euodia, Rahab, Esther, Ruth, Sarah, and. The message tonight is going to focus on one or two women that God really used. The third woman that we're going to be talking about tonight, it's going to be brief and it's kind of sad, but she's a part of the whole story. Some of you don't know me this well, but some that know me real well know this isn't true, I hope. But some that don't know me so well, just because of some positions that I hold, biblically, have believed that I'm down on women a little bit. And that's absolutely not the truth. I've always said my sister was a woman. My mother was a woman. My grandma, who I loved, was a woman. And let me say this because I'm going to mention Catherine Kuhlman here in just a moment. And this is the Lord's honest truth. And again, anyone that knows me knows that this is for sure. Women have been more influential and meant more to me in my life than men. I'm glad I had three strapping boys. Helped me to come up to the plate, step up to the plate a little bit. And they're all tough guys. And I was a lover. But Mother Rhodes, I was boarded out with Mother Rhodes. You've heard that a million times. You'll hear it a few more million times unless the Lord takes me right soon. But Mother Rhodes was a woman of God that I was boarded out with when I was about 2 years old. And I didn't get to live with my own mother until I was in the first grade. And then I was sent to the Red Feather day nursery. Spent all day there from 8 till about 7, except I'd go to school from there and back. But Mother Rhodes was just a woman of God and so influential in my life. My birth mother, of course. I got to go back and live with her when I was about 6 years old at the day nursery, the Red Feather Day Nursery there in Indianapolis, next to the James Whitcomb Riley home. Mrs. Rich, her name was Richardson, called her Mrs. Rich, and I don't even remember her first name, but she was influential in my life. Another woman very influential in my life for my grade school years was Agnes Mahoney. Excuse me, I haven't gotten started yet. Agnes Mahoney. In fact, just today, since she was on my mind, and I've spoken of her before, I Googled to find out if I could find anything about Agnes Mahoney. And she's in the Who's Who of America, was back a few years ago. I just learned today she was born in 1895 and she died in 1981. If you Google Agnes Mahoney, you'll find 4 or 5 or 6 of them. This is the one in Indianapolis, not in LaPorte, Indiana, and not out here in California, but in Indianapolis. And she never got married. She was engaged to the governor of Indiana way back, and he died. Later, she was engaged to the mayor of Indianapolis, and he died early. So she said, and I can remember her talking about this, she said, I'm just thinking God does not want me to get married. And she remained unmarried for the rest of her life. But if you look, and I'm not going to tell you her pedigree, I'm just talking because Agnes Mahoney meant a lot. But if you look her up, you'll see that she won all sorts of awards. She gave her life to young people, to children. She was principal of school number 9, which no longer exists there in Indianapolis, Vonnegut grade school. She taught Bible out at White's Institution, which was an institution for wayward boys out on the west side of Indianapolis. She was Roman Catholic, but it seemed to me, at least as a young man, she seemed like a really strong Christian woman. And from what I read today on the internet, boy, she was really something. So anyway, she meant a lot in my life. And needless to say, my wife that went home almost 5 years ago, greatly influential in my life. And there's been preachers that I've really enjoyed and have meant something to me in the ministry as such, but I never had a man in my life. And so I really hold women in very high esteem. And I have, don't go to town on this, but I have a real attraction to women who are sold out to God. And I'll tell you this, my 3 sons would give evidence to this. One of my favorite Bible teachers is a woman, and I think she knows 8 or 9 languages, and she does an excellent job of teaching the Bible. She still does that. And this past week, there's a guy preacher, and I love him, and he does a great job. And God has used him to speak to my heart as I listen to him. Well, I was going to pull it up, and the church pastor's conference that he preached in, and he's preached in a lot of them, there was a woman, and I'm familiar with her. I'm not going to give you her name, but she she's either gone to be with the Lord right now, or she's around 90, 93 years old. But the preacher that I like so well, that has preached at this pastors conference where there's like 3,000 to 5,000 people in his own church, has been very big. He only does evangelistic work now. He's not a pastor. But this lady, she preached. Now, got to slow down here a sec. The guy that I like so much, when he's preaching, probably in his hour sermon, he has to tell everyone 25 times, sit down, because everyone's excited and they get up, and he's exciting, and God always gives him something really, really good. But anyway, so I tuned into that. But here was this woman that I'm familiar with. I just never heard her preach, and these churches believe in women pastors, which I don't, which is why some people have the opinion they do. In Scripture, God does not allow it. It's just for men. That's all I'll say about that right now. But anyway, this lady, whether she's alive or not, she was well up into her 80s when she was preaching the sermon that I heard. And as she was near the end, where this man preacher that preaches a lot, that I love to hear it, he's always having to tell people, sit down, sit down. Boy, when she was getting near the end of her sermon, pastors and others were on their faces weeping and crying out to God. And God in his grace has used her greatly. I don't think that makes it okay to have women pastors, but God is so good and gracious. But as a pastor, I have to stick to the word. But I'm telling you, there's been some good preachers. And when my wife was still here on this earth, I told this, and I tell it now in retrospect, she'd have probably been a lot better preacher than me. Boy, she was just filled with the Spirit of God, and filled with love, and filled with the Word. But she didn't believe in women preachers either. But I better get to my message tonight. I'm trying to lay a good foundation here, so you understand and don't have the wrong impression of me. I don't believe it's biblical, but I do believe God uses women greatly, and they are to be used. But how I got off track, I was thinking about Kathryn Kuhlman. And I heard this testimony from Kathryn Kuhlman. This isn't hearsay. I heard her say it, and it may have either been on TV or it may have been in a meeting. I went to a couple of her meetings. My wife liked Kathryn Kuhlman, and Kathryn Kuhlman indicated she did not believe in women pastors or women taking any authority over men. And the story, the best I remember her telling it, she said that God had called a man to do what she embarked on eventually, and he did not do it. And then God called another man, and he didn't do it. And I forget exactly what the segue was, but anyway, it was something that needed to be done. So she stepped into those men's shoes, preached, and God just seemed to bless her. If you know Kathryn Kuhlman. Well, now that's over. And I loved Kathryn Kuhlman too. I want to introduce you to some people before we get into the message. And you can glance over Judges chapter 4 and Judges chapter 5 as I'm telling you this. But Ehud is mentioned right in the very first verse of Judges chapter 4. And he was a man used by God greatly, but he doesn't really fit into the story. In fact, chapter 4, verse 1 should have been probably the last verse of chapter 3 in Judges, as far as I'm concerned. God used him, and another man. I can't think of his name right now. I'll tell you when it comes to my mind. Anyway, and there was peace in Israel for 80 years because of Ehud. Well, Jabin, and now the rest of the names do fit into the story tonight. Jabin was king of the Canaanites. He was, or whether they were Canaanites or not, he was king over all of the land of Canaan. And Sisera was his general, or the captain of his armies there in Canaan, of Jabin's armies. And then Deborah gets used by women who believe in women preachers. They'll always point to Deborah, but Deborah was a judge, and best I remember, best I used in Exodus, and there were numbers of women prophets, of course, but she was the only woman judge. She was a prophetess. She was the wife. She was a wife of Lapidot. She was a mother. So Jabin, king of Canaan, Sisera, his general over his armies, Deborah, the woman prophetess who was also a judge and married to Lapidot. Then there was Barak, son of Ahinoam, and he was selected by God to head up the armies of Israel. Then there's a guy by the name of Heber, and Heber was a Kenite, and the Kenites, they were more nomadic. They weren't Jewish and they weren't really Canaanites. They came actually, the Kenites came from Jethro, who was Moses's father-in-law, if you remember. So that was his lineage. And they kind of walked the line and stayed friends with everyone, but they were certainly friendly for years and years and years with Israel. Then there's a woman number two. Woman number one is Deborah. Woman number two is Jael, or JL, as you might want to pronounce it. And she was the wife of Heber, the Kenite. So she was a Canaanite woman herself, though. And she's called most blessed of women. Again, she was the wife of a Kenite, and she's even called the most blessed of women in tents, and that's a reference to the Bedouins. I've been to the Middle East and I've seen numbers. I mean, like 20, a family of 20 Bedouins living in a tent, and not always that many, but many tents. I'm guessing they still have them over there. Probably not as many as they used to have. But anyway, Jael, Deborah was the judge. Jael is this woman who is celebrated as a very heroic woman, and all of the Israelitish women gave her glory. And I don't understand these words as expressive of divine approbation towards Joel, but she was chosen of God. God used her, and she wasn't Jewish, but the Jewish women lauded her. Well, with that said, I'm going to go to the scriptures myself now, in Judges chapter 4, and I want to go through this story. You can follow along. I'm going to begin in Judges chapter 4 and verse 1. Then the sons of Israel did evil again in the sight of Yahweh, And this was after Ehud had died. And remember, I mentioned that he had been used greatly by God, and because he obeyed God and God worked through him, there was 80 years of peace and prosperity in Israel, God having used him. But over the time, as happens over and over and over again, Israel started sliding away from Yahweh God and getting involved with other gods and their own lusts and their own thoughts, their own desires. So we read that the sons of Israel, again, was involved in evil. And that was after Ehud had died. And Yahweh sold them into the hand of Jabin, who was the king of Canaan. And we see that happening over and over and over again. God's people, what happens in the spirit comes out in the natural. And what we see in the natural with individuals and churches is what's going on in the spirit. God's people get away from him in the spirit and walking with him, then he lets them get away in the natural, and he has something to do with it. He put them into the hands of his people, into the hands, the lordship, the kingdom of Jabin. And when people get away from God, that is bondage. If they've never been born again, that's bondage. Jesus died to set us free. So they get under the hand, like they had been with Pharaoh. They got under the hand of Jabin, the king, and he reigned in a place called Hazor. And he was not a nice guy. And though he had taken control of them, because God, he didn't give God the credit. He thought it was his own power, his own gods that had caused him to take control and defeat Israel and be king over them. But this was all the hand of God, Yahweh God. And so he had the captain of his army, who was Sisera, and Sisera lived in Roshet HaGoyim, and that's a place there in Canaan. And the sons of Israel, because of the heavy hand of Jabin and Sisera, who was not a nice guy, the captain of his army, his general, they started crying out to God. Remember in the wilderness, when they were getting away from God, and God let poison snakes come into the camp, remember? And then they cried out, "Oh, Moses, Moses, we're sorry, we repent. Ask God to take away this serpents." And Moses went to God, and God said, "No, I'm not going to do that. But if you'll make a snake out of bronze and put it on a pole and lift it up and plant it, then tell everyone, you go look at the bronze snake and believe, you'll be healed." That's in Numbers. So that's another story. But I'm just saying, over and over and over again, God lets what is happening in people's hearts be played out in the natural. They're letting themselves become captive and disregarding the lordship and the love of God. He lets that play out in the natural. And that gains their attention, gains our attention. So anyway, the sons of Israel cried out, and they're saying, "God, they're being so mean to us. They're wicked," which they were acting wicked themselves. "And he's got 900 iron chariots." That's a big army. And iron chariots, they were ready for battling anyone. And this had been going on for about 20 years. Well, about this time, God raises up a woman, Deborah, a prophetess, a wife of Lapidot, and she was judging Israel at the time. Now, she didn't really have authority except to adjudicate. She was in a place between Kadesh and Ramah. I forget the name of it. Anyway, she had a place by a tree. In fact, they called it the tree of Deborah. And so when there were disputes among the Jewish people, they would go to Deborah, and she would adjudicate after listening to whatever the disagreement was. Ramah, and I think isn't Ramah where Ramah? I think that's where Samuel was from too, or where he lived. Doesn't matter. So anyway, they would come up to her for judgment. Now I'm in verse 6, if you're following along. And she went and she summoned Barak, who's the son of Ahinoam, from Kadesh, Naphtali. And, you know, Naphtali, one of the tribes. And the only reason Naphtali is there is because there were 2 or 3 towns, locations called Kadesh. So he was, Barak was in Kadesh in the Naphtali area. And so she summoned him, and he came to her, and she said, behold, now this is Deborah. And she says, behold, Yahweh, the God of Israel, has commanded, you're to go and march to Mount Tabor, and you're to take 10,000 men. That sounds like quite a number, but it was not a big number in comparison to what he was going to be confronting. So she said, you're to go to Mount Tabor, take with you 10,000 men from the sons of Naphtali and also sons of Zebulun. And God says this, she's telling him, and God says this, I will draw out Sisera, the general under Jabin, the king of Canaan. I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, with his chariots and with his many troops to the river Kishon. And I will give him into your hand. God directs all this stuff. They were under the hand of Jabin the king because God, no matter how it looked in the natural to the people, God was the one that had handed his people over to the rulership, to the bondage of Jabin the king. Now Deborah is saying, Yahweh wants you, Barak, and it seems like maybe Barak had been hearing from God possibly about this too. And she's saying, here's where you're to go. Here's the troops that you're to take, 10,000. And God is going to bring Sisera and his army out so that you guys can slaughter him, so that our army can slaughter their army. I will give them into your hand. Then Barak said, I wonder if he was raised like I was. Barak said to Deborah, now this is after hearing what God said through this prophetess. Well, if you'll go with me, I'll go. But if you don't go with me, I'm not going. I can almost relate with him a little bit. Here's a woman, prophetess, a woman telling Barak, God said, but it's his life on the line as far as he's looking at it. So he says, I wonder if a little bit of this was to find out if she really thought she heard from God. Well, Deborah, if you'll go with me, I'll go. If you don't go with me, I ain't going. Well, she said, I'll go with you. I'll go with you, but the honor and the glory that God was going to give to you is going to be withheld from you, and a woman is going to do the job that I wanted you to do. She's going to be the capstone in all of this. And she is going to be well and greatly spoken of. And till you get down further in the story, you get to thinking she's talking about herself, but it's not. Deborah's woman number one. This woman, Jael, is woman number two. So anyway, she said, well, I'll go with you. So nevertheless, the honor is not going to be yours, but on this journey that God was going to take you, and he's still going, but the honor and the glory is going to go to a woman, taking Sisera, getting Sisera, this mean, wicked general of Jabin, king of Canaan. So Deborah gets everything ready, and she goes with Barak to Kadesh, Naphtali, where he lived. And so he can get the armies put together and everything. So Barak called the soldiers out of Zebulun and out of Naphtali. He got his 10,000 men, and he starts on his way, Deborah right there with him, up to do battle. Well, I'm in verse 11 now, Judges chapter 4, verse 11. Now Heber, the Kenite, he's the one that I said is from the family of Jethro. I mean, his lineage came through Jethro, had separated himself from the Canaanites, and he had moved over close to Kadesh Naphtali. And again, he's very friendly. He's very friendly with the Jewish people, and he's living over by what is called the Oak of Zaanani, which is near Zaanani, which is close to Kadesh. And then word was sent to Sisera that Barak, the son of Ahinoam, had gone to Mount Tabor. He's gathering troops to attack, to do battle. So Sisera called all of his army together, deployed his 900 iron chariots and all the people who were with him, and they went to Haroshet Hagoyim, to the rip from there to the river of Kishon. Deborah said, the prophetess, Deborah said to Barak, arise. This is the day that Yahweh is going to give Sisera and the armies of Jabin into your hands. So you need to get up and get down to Mount Tabor with your 10,000 men and get into battle. But know this, you're going to go do battle, Barak, but Yahweh has already, it's as well as the deal is done, but you have to go and obey God. You go into battle, and Yahweh has brought Sisera, rooted Sisera out into the open, and all of his chariots and his army with all of their swords and everything, and they're ready to do battle. And so Sisera, and they are in the battle. Well, the battle, of course, because of God, the battle is going with Barak. Now, in the midst of all this battle, Sisera, and this is on a windy road. I think I missed telling you about the windy road. Maybe I'll mention it a little bit later. But his chariot apparently couldn't really ride fast and ride the way he wanted it. And besides that, they were losing the battle to Barak. And so Sisera gets out of his own chariot, and he starts running on foot. He's running away from the battle, and he's hiding. But the battle is going on. So now we're to verse 16, Judges 4:16. Barak pursued the chariots and the armies of the Canaanites, and all of the army of Sisera were defeated. They fell by the edge of the sword. And here's what God's word says: not one was left. Sisera's army was wiped out 100%. Well, Sisera, meanwhile, is fleeing on foot. And he goes to the tent of Jael, the wife of the Kenite, Heber the Kenite. And by the way, they were friends too. The Kenites were peace-loving people, and they tried to stay friendly with everyone, but they were a little more friendly with the Jews, and they were living in a Jewish area. So Sisera flees on foot, and he runs and finds the tent. He's heard that they had moved, and he runs to the tent of Heber and Jael. Well, Heber's not there. I don't know where he's at this time, but Jael is there, the wife of Heber, and they were friends and everything. And then in verse 18 we read that Jael went out to meet Sisera. Now, how in the world would she go out to meet Sisera? Was he in the woods, and did he holler, Jael, Jael, are you there? It's possible. Makes me wonder a little bit whether he'd want to be hollering in the woods with Barak and his army looking to slaughter him and his army, which they'd already done as far as his army is concerned. But I find it interesting that Jael went out to meet him, and I'm thinking, doesn't say it, but read it for yourself in about chapter 4, verse 18. Jael goes out to meet him. Now, if he wasn't hollering somehow and saying, are you there, are you there, are you there? God has moved upon her. The Spirit of God has moved upon her, told her some things like God had told Deborah. And so she goes out to meet Sisera. And when she sees him, she said, come here, turn aside, come on. Turn aside with me. Don't be afraid. Now, this is Jael, Jael. This is Jael telling Sisera, don't be afraid. You come with me. And they've been friends, the Kenites and the Canaanites. And she said, don't be afraid. Come on into my tent. And she had a place dug under there, a crevice, obviously, because she had a rug that she could put over it. Maybe some boards were there too. But anyway, so she had him, showed him where he could get in, lie down, and she'd put a rug over him. Well, he said, you have a little bit of water. Could I have some water? I'm really, really thirsty. And she said, I've got something better. And so she had a bottle of water, a bottle of milk, and she gave that to him to drink. And he got down in that crevice. She covered him with a rug and hid him. This is Sisera hiding in Jael's tent. Well, he said, Jael, I want you to stand in the doorway of the tent, and if anyone comes by, Barak, or if anyone, any soldier, anyone comes by asking if you've seen me or if I'm in the tent or anything, tell them no. Tell them no. You say, no, I haven't seen him. No, he's no place around here or anything. Well, we come to the death of Sisera, verse 21. We come to the death of Sisera. But Jael, Heber's wife, now he's had milk, he's tired, he's under the covers, under a rug. She went and took how tents had stakes. I guess they still do, only they're out of wire now. But she got a, a sharp stake, like you would use to peg for a tent. And she also seized a heavy hammer in her hand, and she went back in, snuck over to where he was. He's asleep, obviously, on his side. She put the stake there and whack! She nailed him to the floor. That stake went right through his head. He obviously was sleeping on the side, otherwise it would have gone through his forehead and into the ground. How did she know to kill him? God is dealing with this woman. Men, husbands, we need to listen to our wives. We need to listen to women sometimes. That doesn't mean they rule or take the leadership, but God gives women an awful lot of wisdom. And I'm telling you, most of the wisdom that I've gotten in my life, I don't want that to be the standard, but most of the wisdom that I've got in my life, aside from being with God and in His Word, have come through women. The first things I ever learned about God was from Mother Rhodes. So God uses women, and God uses wives and mothers and sisters and godly women. Well, he was exhausted. He went to sleep. He had milk. He feels safe. And she drives this peg right through his head. And wouldn't you know it, Barak, who had been pursuing Sisera, is coming closer, coming by, and Jael comes out to meet him, and she says, now listen to this. She says to Barak, the general of the army of Israel, she says to Barak, come here. Now remember, she invited Sisera into her tent. Now she's inviting Barak into her tent. And she says to Barak, you come here and I'll show you the man whom you are seeking. We're not told how she knows all of this stuff, but one way or another, God is giving her information. It almost doesn't matter how it happened. What's important is it did happen. So she says to Barak, the general, here, come on in here. Come into my tent. Here's the man that you've been looking for. And Barak entered into the temple with her, and lo and behold, there's Sisera lying dead on the floor with a stake through his head. Well, Sisera's dead. Now, I said there's 3 women, and we've talked about 2 women, Deborah and Jael. There's got to be a 3rd woman here someplace, but right now we've got the death of the king coming up. Sisera is dead now, but Jabin, the king. So we're in Judges chapter 4, verse 23. So God subdued Jabin and all of his army, all of them. Jabin, the king of Canaan, to the sons of Israel. So the hand of the sons, their power, the hand of the sons of Israel pressed harder and harder and harder upon, and this is kind of a recap, upon Jabin, the king of Canaan, until they destroyed him. I mean, he was destroyed as far as his army and now his kingdom, but he himself has met his Waterloo at the hand of Barak. Well, we have 2 women and the death of a king now, and also the death of a warrior, Sisera. But now we go to chapter 5, verse 1, and verses 1 through 27. I'm not going to hardly spend any time on that, but verses 1 through 27 is basically a song of poetry about all that had taken place and why it took place. Now, I said that Deborah was a judge, she was a prophetess, she was a mother, she was a wife. She had to take care of business going with Barak. I mean, this is some woman. Talk about Proverbs 31 woman. This was a Proverbs 31 woman. So anyway, chapter 5, verse 1. Then Deborah and Barak, the son of Abinoam, sang on that day this song. It starts out like this. The leaders led in Israel. The people volunteered. Bless Yahweh. Hear, O kings. Give ear, O rulers. I to Yahweh. I will sing. I will sing praise to Yahweh, the God of Israel. Yahweh, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the field of Edom, the earth quaked. The heavens also dripped. The clouds were giving rain. The mountains quaked at the presence of Yahweh. This Sinai, at the presence of Yahweh, the God of Israel, so to speak. God's there. He's doing things. He's using the elements. And she's making a poem. She's singing a song. She's a singer too. She and Barak are singing a duet there. So continuing on in this song poetry, verse 6, in the days of Shamgar, Shamgar is the other guy that was associated with right after Ehud, when 80 years of peace had come before what we're talking about now. Remember, I said earlier I couldn't think of his name. So anyway, in his days, in the days of Jael, the highways were deserted. Too many thieves, killers, bad people. And so people were traveling in roundabout ways, going way out of their way. The peasants ceased to be seen in all of that area. They ceased in Israel. They were staying under cover or fleeing for other places. And listen to what she says. Deborah says, until I arose, a mother in Israel. Praise God for mothers. But she was a mother to Israel during this time, but she was a mother. And she said, and so I arose, a mother in Israel. And the song talks about what had caused all of this to happen as far as Sisera and God's people being under the rulership of Jabin, the king of the Canaanites. New gods were chosen. That's Waterloo for Israel. The church, God's people. You start looking at other gods. Oh, I believe in Jehovah, but there's more than just Jehovah. Well, new gods were chosen. And there was war in their cities and gates. And they weren't prepared for battle. As good soldiers of Jesus Christ, we're to have the whole armor of God. Well, they didn't have any spears. It was, as far as they were concerned, there's peace. We're God's people. Now, she's singing about what had happened and what brought them into captivity. And not a spear, not a knife seen among 40,000 Israelites. And my heart goes out to the commanders of Israel, the volunteers among the people. Bless Yahweh. You who ride white, and it says white donkeys. And I looked up a little bit on that. It seems like they were talking about, and it wasn't exactly a word white. It was more like silver, but it seems like it may have had to do with they were sleek and well fed. Their donkeys were sleek and well fed. And you sit on rich carpets. And all of you travel on the roads wherever you want to go, and you're singing all the time, and everything is happy and hunky-dory. At the sound of those who divide flocks at watering places, they were there to recount the righteous deeds of Yahweh, the righteous deeds for his peasantry in Israel, but they weren't living for him. You can sing the songs of Zion and be in Babylon. Come out of her, my people, God says. I'm amazed. I'm only going to use this as an illustration, and I've got a witness because I've had personal testimony given to me by two different people in the past, no one recently or in the last few years, but I had a Christian male friend who talked about how he would take he was married and he had a girlfriend who was married, and they would sneak, and they were both Christians, or at least he was, and they go to church together sometimes. He'd take her to church. And then I had another one give me a witness. She was a Christian woman. She had a boyfriend. She'd take him to church. So there's a lot of pretenders and a lot of taking some chances. I mean, God disciplines those whom he loves. That's kind of what Israel were doing. They were trying to play both ends against the middle. We love God. We sing the songs of Zion, but... So anyway, verse 12. Awake, awake, Deborah, awake, awake. Sing a song. Arise, Barak. Take your captives, O son of Abinoam. Then survivors came down to the nobles. The people of Yahweh came down to me in hordes like warriors from Ephraim, those whose root is from Amalek, came down. Following you guys, Benjamin, Machir, Zebulun, some of the people from the tribe of Zebulun, those who wield the sword and the staff of office. The princes of Issachar were with Deborah. And remember, Issachar and Zebulun, I think that's right. Got so much of this story, I need to slow down and make sure I'm thinking this through right. Anyway, they were as Issachar, so was Barak. And into the valley, they rushed in at his heels. Among the divisions of Reuben, there was great resolve of heart. We're going to do this. But why did you sit among the sheepfolds? Just to listen to your sheep baa and your cows moo and all that stuff? Among the divisions of Reuben, there was much searching of heart. There was great searching of heart. I mean, it had come down to that. So anyway, the kings came and fought, kings of Canaan. That was close to, you've heard of the Valley of Armageddon, or Valley of Megiddo, and that was close there. Well, anyway, God used, and I mentioned this before, but God used weather conditions. He's in control of the weather. Don't think that that's something that used to happen, or don't think that that's something that was just made up by biblical writers. This is God's word. He's still in control of the weather. And so there's a statement there. It says that the stars of heaven fought. And sometimes, an awful lot of times, stars are a word that's used for messengers. And so maybe this was, but the whole context seems like weather conditions and all, he's using in this battle to help Barak with his only 10,000 men to defeat the army of Jabin the king, with Sisera leading them. So anyway, that's going on. Verse 23, I said I was getting into this and I'm going more into it than I really want to. But the angel of Yahweh, who is Christ pre-incarnate, said to curse Meroz. And you might see that in verse 23 of chapter 5. And we don't know that much about Meroz, but it just seems like that was a Jewish town. And when all of this battle was going on, and Barak and his army needed some help, they didn't want to have anything to do with it. They wouldn't help. So anyway, now to verse 24, and we're coming to the end of this song. Most blessed of women is Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Most blessed is she in the tent. That seems to be a reference to she was the most blessed woman of all the Bedouins, or the Kenites, or the Canaanite women. And she mentions in this song how Sisera had asked for water and she gave him milk, and in a magnificent bowl, which we didn't read earlier, but this is part of her song, so it must have happened. In a magnificent bowl, she brought him curds. She reached out her hand. When he was asleep, she reached out her hand for a peg. In her right hand, a workman's hammer, whack. Then she struck Sisera. She smashed his head. She shattered his head from the temple all over the place. Well, of course, he's dead. Well, that's pretty much the end of the song, verse 27. But it's kind of a recap and fills in a little bit, just here and there, just a little bit. Well, verse 28 then, you might want to follow along, and we'll get just about to the end. Better, I've already been talking an hour. Yikes. I get to enjoying these stories, telling maybe too many side stories. Well, anyway, this is a reference, and actually this is still part of the end of the song. Pretty much ended at verse 27, but 28 through 30 is still kind of the end of the song. Not a chorus, but the end of the song. Out of the window she looked and lamented. She who? Well, Barak and Deborah, when they're doing this poem, singing this song and all, they knew, and we're going to find out. But out the window she looked, and she's lamenting. The mother of Sisera is looking through the lattice. The mother of Sisera. We didn't read that earlier. But Deborah and Barak have come to know this. One way or another, they know about what had happened. Here's the mother of Sisera, the general of the army of the Canaanites who had the stake through his head. Mom didn't know about that. Sisera's mom did not know. She figured her wicked, strong, man's man, warrior son is going to wipe those Jews out that rebelled. Take care of their army just like that of 10,000. But she's looking out the lattice. And Mom is wondering, what's delaying his chariot? Why isn't his chariot coming? And this is part of how it's worded, why do the hoofbeats of the horses of his chariot, why do I not hear any of that? What's going on? And what's holding everything up? And she had some wise women, princesses. Her wise princesses would answer her. Then she'd repeat things to herself. She's so distraught and wondering, and she's distraught, and she's just wondering, what's detained him? Oh, maybe they're gathering all of the spoil. Maybe they're burying the Israeli army. Maybe they're taking off all of their jewelry and gold out of their teeth or whatever. Maybe that's what's taking them so long. And their beautiful rugs and everything. So maybe that's the reason why. Spoil of dyed work, embroidered, dyed work of double embroidery on the neck of the spoiler. What is going on? Anyway, do you understand this without getting down into that any deeper? Mom is wondering, what has happened to Sisera? What happened to my son? What is taking him so long? I want you to note this. I said there's 3 women and a dead king. Sisera, this woman's son, is also dead, the general. But it's Jabin, the king's army. Sisera was under him. Deborah, the judge, the prophetess, the mother, the wife. Jael, the one that put that stake through Sisera's head. The third woman is a woman, she wasn't concerned about how ruthless her son was, how mean he was, how he maimed people, how he was going out with the intention of wiping people out. She wasn't concerned that he didn't worship the God of Israel, but then neither did she. She was a godless woman, but she loved her son, and she's wondering, what happened to her? What happened to him? What happened to my son? Well, wicked mother who raised a wicked son who's done wickedly, God's killed him. Three women and a dead king. Deborah, Jael, and Sisera's mother, the king of Jabin, is dead. In verse 31, thus let all your enemies perish, Yahweh. This is Deborah and Barak still. Thus let your enemies perish, Yahweh, but let those who love you be like the rising sun in its shining warm might. And the land, from that point on, because Israel repented, they saw the hand of God, they came back to him, there was peace for 40 years. Thus God used Deborah, a wife, a mother, a prophetess, a judge, an engager, going with Barak, a singer, a songwriter. God used a woman to get Israel back on track and defeat the enemy. Jael, a wife, a friend of God, friendly to Israel, to the Jews, to the congregation of Israel. She did what Barak was supposed to do. But being used by God for the final nail in the coffin, so to speak, he chose a woman to do it because Barak had not stepped up to the plate. Deborah, if you go with me, I'm going. But if you're not going to go with me, I'm not going. Well, God used Deborah. God used Jael. And sadly, Sisera's mother, longing for and missing her unholy, violent son, and with never a thought about how her important son had treated people wickedly, and neither she nor her son Sisera cared about the lives of other people, didn't care about righteousness or the God of Israel. Well, that's pretty much the end of the story, except I do have one more thing, and I'm sorry I went so long. I'm not too sorry, but I didn't intend to go this long. Men. Then there's Barak. Men, I've been talking about him. Then there is Barak. And I said, I can kind of identify with him. I want you to go with me. If you heard from God, then go with me. I don't know exactly what to say about Barak. He was chosen by God. He received the word from Deborah and listened. He believed enough. He wanted her to go with him, but he believed enough to go out. And he did lead the Israeli army into defeating the armies of Jabin, who were much stronger. Barak was chosen and he got the victory. But here's the interesting thing also. In the great faith chapter, Hebrews chapter 11, Barak is mentioned in the honor roll there as one of the great men of faith. Well, I said I don't know exactly what to say about that. So since I don't know exactly what to say about it, I'll just tell you the facts. And then you can do with it whatever you want. If you have any ideas, let me know. Anyway, I pray that God uses this some way, somehow, to anyone that's listening to this tonight or will be listening to this in the next several days or weeks. I ask your blessings, Father, in Jesus' name. By God's grace, I'll be right here on Sunday morning, 11 o'clock, and Sunday evening at 6:30. And with that, I'm going to say adios, goodbye, Lila Tov in Hebrew, Lila Tov. And I'll say the same thing over here. I got it. Yeah, I got it. There you go.